I'm ripping off this idea from TB Skyen's Pokemon videos, so go check those out. Rose is not what I'd call anything great, though I guess an apt descriptor is serviceable enough. Now, take a guess whether I'm talking about the episode or the character, I don't think Doctor Who really finds its creative voice as a modern show until Series 3, and Rose definitely feels like the premiere of a show that hasn't fully worked out what its identity is. That complaint is pretty broad though, since it does feel like Chris Eccleston and Billie Piper have a pretty good grasp of their characters and screen chemistry right out the gate. My prevailing thought is that if I had started the show here, I would be intrigued but in no rush to continue. It's not just the overall sense of finding its footing, the specific plot of this episode where our heroes stop an invasion of plastic Nestine also does nothing to grab me. It's a comparatively safe, simple, easy to digest opening adventure, which was probably the right call. But once you know what this show can do, and even what it can do while still ingratiating new viewers, I don't think there's much of value left in Rose. The End of the World is, first of all, a really clever title, teasing some kind of conflict with massive stakes right out the gate, only for the episode itself to end up a pretty small, kinda silly murder mystery motivated by pettiness. Unfortunately, said murder mystery isn't super compelling, and I mentally checked out of the episode several times for long stretches when watching it for this video. This story does really well to capture how overwhelming the situation would be as anyone's first TARDIS adventure, and following Rose's very grounded reaction to it and the Doctor's lack of awareness stemming from being alone so long is a great way to establish modern Who as more emotionally attuned and dramatically down-to-earth than classic Who. The tension of the Doctor being such a big question mark comes through well too. The humor juxtaposing the deadly and bonkers circumstances with an officious and casual tone is chuckle-worthy, though it's something the show has done much better before and since. This episode has a lot of strengths on paper, but in the end, there's just nothing to invest me in Cassandra's dumb scheme. I've talked about the Unquiet Dead before, when I revisited it for a video a couple years ago all about episodes I tend to dismiss as lame and bad. Back then, I basically accused it of squandering or chickening out of a potentially great premise, and I think that assessment holds true. The question of whether it's right to allow endangered aliens refuge inside of human corpses is an inspired, dark, engaging moral quandary, and the episode speaks to it just long enough to whet the appetite before stepping way back into a generic plot where evil aliens attack our lead characters. There's parts of Charles Dickens' involvement that I like, but it mostly feels like a beta test for better arcs for historical figures in later episodes. This is also noteworthy for always being the episode where I'm most uncomfortable with the overtly flirtatious Nine and Rose dynamic. I'm sorry, but I'll just never be into any version of the Doctor indulging a 19-year-old in that kind of thing. There are positives to the episode though, namely how effectively creepy it is, getting more of the Doctor's alien and pragmatic characterization, and all of the performances. The Aliens of London in World War III is a fascinating mess of a story. The idea of exploring what happens when the Doctor rips someone out of their domestic life and drops them off after some actual time has passed and their loved ones come for his neck is another one of those great statements of intent regarding this as a more modern take on the show. But then you get to the farting and the slapstick and the hammy villain performances and it just doesn't cohere. This was in the first batch of stories that they filmed for the show, and you can tell with how much the Slitheen as a concept reek of a show that hasn't fully sussed out its target audience. Series 1 and 2 both feel kind of like watching a first draft of what Doctor Who under Russel T Davies would eventually become, and this story is one of the stronger exemplars of that feeling. Dalek is really frickin' solid. For as well written as this one is though, not to mention brilliantly performed by Eccleston, I've always had reservations about the introduction of the Daleks to a modern audience, basically feeling like an epilogue to a conflict we never saw. I know that in British culture, Daleks are such a ubiquitous image that there's likely not a soul in 2005 who wasn't familiar, and we're years out from the show attempting to court an overseas audience, but as a lowly American, it feels odd that this very conclusive feeling story is bound to be so many people's first with these creatures. I don't know, I had to say something here that wasn't just the millionth praise of it's great. All that aside, the Daleks never get more imposing than right here, and Henry Van Staten is a lovably hateable slimeball. Dalek manages to be the first properly great story of modern Who, and a perfect case for the Daleks as a compelling well of drama and scares. The Long Game is a story that's so unmemorable that I sometimes struggle to remember what the title is within moments of having seen it. It truly is a shame that such a famous face like Simon Pegg is stuck in such a of an episode, though he's clearly having fun hamming it up. It feels like not a lot happens in this story. There's not much in the way of strong or memorable dialogue. All the concepts are just on the cusp of compelling without crossing over, and it's just kind of a drag, in which 10 minutes feels more like 30. Adam is an interesting character in theory, if not in practice, and I think it's a missed opportunity that we've never tried to explore that archetype again in nearly 20 years. Someone who fails the companion test, not due to malice, but because of tunnel vision and duplicity and just being kind of a weenie. I'd love to see another instance of the Doctor giving someone a chance to travel only for them to just be the wrong kind of person. I like Kathika's arc, and the episode peaks in its final moments, but there's just not much for me here as a total package. Father's Day is the kind of episode I wish we got more of, in the sense that it is above anything else a mood piece. It doesn't rush through any of its story, it just sets this feeling of discomfort and then has our characters sit in it for basically the whole runtime. It's another case of the show clearly not having worked out its internal mechanics, since it just fragrantly disregards any past or future sense of what a time paradox looks like in Doctor Who. Honestly, I wish more stories did that as well, because the Reapers are really fun, really imposing creatures, and I'd love to get more wacky, scary concepts like that, which only occur when you say hang the code and do something unprecedented. I also want to ask Paul Cornell if he's ever seen The Langoliers. This one is great, just very different. The Empty Child in The Doctor Dances is really clever, and while Stephen Moffat will eventually make attempts at cleverness into a detriment, especially in his own era, what I mainly mean is that the story is cleverly constructed. It's a bunch of little interconnected mysteries serving as breadcrumbs for one big mystery, and each new reveal compounds the stakes and the sense of tragedy. Nancy's story is a great emotional core, and Jack Harkness makes a really engaging first impression as the Doctor's slick and morally questionable foil. If I had to lob one minor complaint at it, it doesn't feel like Moffat is super interested in Rose as a character across either of his stories featuring her, and so here she's mainly just a lens through which the viewer experiences Jack, and at worst an object for the two boys to compete over. It's a small trepidation with an otherwise great story. Boomtown is another one of those that I think tends to go unremarked upon and forgotten by myself, if not the fandom at large, but on a rewatch it's a mostly compelling little episode. And the thing that really sells it is Annette Badland's performance as the Celine formerly going by Margaret Blaine. With the way this show so often structures itself, it's very rare to get villain character studies, and I wish we got them more because it mostly works here, and Badland hits the beats with aplomb. She and Eccleston have amazing chemistry and are doing some fantastic performing against each other, and the same ends up being true for Billie Piper and Noel Clarke. It feels like Mickey's place in the show's dynamic gets solidified here, and it's honestly quite sad, but also exactly what it needs to be. Despite my dislike of the Slitheen's patented fart humor, this is also the funniest episode of Series 1 by a good margin. The Empty Child two-parter was more clever in its humor, but this is the only story that gets those full-throated belly laughs. It's a shame that the game shows, which make up so much of the first half of the story, immediately date it, because beyond those, Bad Wolf and The Parting of the Ways are pretty close to perfect. The tone stays appropriately dark and tense through the whole thing, the tension ratcheting up to the reveal of the Daleks' return. We get a pretty effective death fake-out with Rose, the Daleks massacring a satellite full of people, Eccleston and Piper putting their all into the heaviest dramatic scenes of the show so far, all building up to this incredible release of all that tension as the story resolves, the Doctor and Rose save each other, and the Doctor regenerates. By now, you should guess that the kiss skeeves me out, but it's such a minor quibble in a story that basically does everything right otherwise, and it's just totally captivating. As a whole, Series 1 feels like a focused exercise in working out how Doctor Who can work in the 21st century. This first year is all about modernizing the show's tropes, and in many ways that gave us a run of episodes that plays things kinda safe, and in the first half especially tended to let story quality be less of a priority than world building, tone setting, and establishing a base level of where the show could take us. Were it not for the presence of Dalek, I'd call the entire opening half of the season a wash, but thankfully it pulls itself together in the back half with hit after hit, and makes sure to end on a high note. Eccleston and Piper also do great to carry every episode no matter how questionable the script, even if the dynamic of their characters as written isn't one that I ever fully warm to. As I mentioned in the previous short, I've never really been the biggest fan of Rose's relationship with the Doctor, or her as a character at all, really, which makes revisiting the Christmas Invasion kind of a hard sell. It's a shame, because Billie Piper really is a great actress, and in theory, throwing her into an alien invasion while the Doctor is comatose is a great final proof for her as a co-lead, but I just find this thing so hard to invest in. I get that Rose is the audience surrogate, and is going through the stages of grief for Eccleston's Doctor the way the viewer is expected to, but I just find her so whiny and pathetic and unproactive throughout, and it leaves me really frustrated and unengaged. Tennant only gets to actually do anything in the final quarter of the story, and he makes a hell of an impression impression, even though the episode seems more self-conscious than it should be, that they haven't worked out what his take on the character is yet. The final scene with Harriet Jones is iconic and really effective in a vacuum, but it loses some heat when I remember that this is only her second appearance on the show. Overall, it's just not engaging enough a story to compensate for too little Doctor. Right from the jump, New Earth really lays the schmaltz on thick in regards to the Doctor and Rose relationship. The two of them being too cutesy and flirty was already a problem for me with Eccleston, but with Tennant it's doubled, and it makes for one of my least favorite TARDIS dynamics. That said, the premise of a corrupt hospital using human experimentation for miracle cures is a fun little mystery that allows Tennant to showcase his Doctor's capacity for moral outrage, though I think allowing the hospital's experiments magical, unexplained sentience is a pretty contrived way to compound the atrocity here. Piper and Tennant playing the returning villain Cassandra in Rose and Ten's bodies is really fun. They go all in with the voice, expression, the body language, they even walk differently. Cassandra is a fun presence overall, and is allowed some real dimension as the story forces her into an empathetic character arc. This episode is a stronger one than I tend to remember, and is elevated by an especially effective final scene. Tooth and Claw is another one that's just kind of alright. In keeping with Tennant having quickly established himself as the quote-unquote action hero Doctor, this one is all adrenaline and forward motion. Basically a base under siege story with the cast being chased deeper and deeper into one building by a monster. There's really just not a ton to say about it. I like the moody, washed out aesthetic, and to this day I'm not sure what the deal is with the Kung Fu monks as a creative choice. But apart from Tennant doing his best to further establish his new take on the character and a memorably annoying running gag, there's not much here to comment on. Watching School Reunion is actually one of my earliest memories of Doctor Who. The idea of the Doctor and companions having to infiltrate a school as staff is a fun premise, and I can see why the show would revisit the same broad idea years later in The Caretaker. It's no wonder why that premise falls to the background here though, in service of the return of Elizabeth Sladen as fan-favorite companion Sarah Jane Smith. Sladen herself is endlessly charming, and this is the first episode of the show to really dig into what would become a common theme of the Doctor having to face the way his presence has had long-term impacts on the lives and feelings of the companions he never goes back to once their time together is done. That stuff is all grand, but it's undermined some by Rose and Sarah Jane's petty, catty arguing, which does a major disservice to both characters and feels very gender stereotypy. It's also fun seeing David Tennant square off against Anthony Stewart Head, however brief it is, and I like Mr. Finch as a villain who so genuinely admires the Doctor's intelligence. The Girl in the Fireplace was an early favorite of mine when watching through the show for the first time, which makes it kinda weird that it's now the early Moffat story which I tend to forget about most often. There's no real reason for that which has anything to do with the contents of the episode itself, because it's an incredibly strong one. Later Moffat scripts will eventually fall into this trap where they have too many clever ideas jammed into one episode for any of them to fully land. But this one juggles three really fun concepts pretty masterfully. We have the premise of a spaceship and its automation cannibalizing its crew for parts, and that same ship stalking a long-dead woman across time in order to complete the puzzle, which are fun enough, but it's the timey-wimey relationship between the Doctor and Madame de Pompadour which gives the story its heart. I'm not the first to point out that the idea of the Doctor as a sort of imaginary friend and someone who leaves deep impressions on people's lives, while years for them go by as moments for him, are themes that Moffat would tackle again and expand on all throughout his time as showrunner. But I like that this episode exists as a powerful, self-contained expression of those concepts. Rise of the Cybermen and Age of Steel is good. I like how comparatively subtle this story is about positioning Mickey as the antithesis of the Cybermen. Mickey is taken for granted by the Doctor and Rose because he's ordinary and unexceptional, but he's also all heart, and his worth as a guy who means well is inherent. If anything, Mickey is the real protagonist of the story in terms of character journey, with Rose coming in second and the Doctor a distant third. Which is really okay. I actually tend to enjoy stories that position the Doctor as a genius hero who explains and solves the plot while ultimately being pretty static, and letting his companions or even the one-offs take the real dynamic character work. A lot of the best modern Cybermen moments come from this introductory story, and I like that more than any story since, this one really hones in on part of the horror of the Cybermen being their uniformity. The sense of losing either yourself or a loved one to become one of a million like things. Not exactly an all-timer, but the Cybermen don't get this good again for a long while. The Idiot's Lantern makes me angry, which sucks because there's a lot to like in it. For one, it's nicely stylish. The mood, costumes, sets, lighting, and direction in the first two-thirds are all very noir. Unfortunately, it really loses me in the third act. For one, I don't find The Wire a very interesting antagonist, and I think a show like Doctor Who should have more thematically interesting to say, with a story where the villain is literally television. The pivot from a detective story to a more conventional race against the clock in the climax is also a real downgrade. More substantively, Basically, Eddie Connolly is an utterly despicable, fascistic slimeball of a character, and the notion that such a person is in some way entitled to pity or affection really rubs me the wrong way. The writing, directing, and the acting for Eddie, Rita, and Tommy all do too good a job at earning my scorn for this detestable, abusive man. Having the final image of the story be looking on in approval as the child he threatened and mocked is basically saddled with his well-being makes me genuinely angry enough to dismiss the episode outright. The Impossible Planet and the Satan Pit are freaking intense, man. It's rare for this show to put theology at the center of a story, and it's impressive that this two-parter manages to be such an effective exploration of belief and superstition, while also basically being Doctor Who Does Die Hard, but with zombies. It was kind of funny rewatching this one and realizing just how much of what I remember specifically comes from Part 2. It's one of those stories that's jam-packed without feeling at all rushed, an early example of a story that feels like a big blockbuster. The Sanctuary-based crew is all well acted and very quickly endearing, and it's one of Rose's strongest showings as a character. This is something I haven't made a point to mention before now, but it's around this story that I think Murray Gold really finds the musical voice of this show. There's some all-time great tracks from this story. Hey, it's the Channel Pup episode. Love and Monsters was, for a long time, one of the most vocally hated episodes in the entire show. I actually don't think the story is quite as awful as its reputation suggests, though I certainly wouldn't say it's great either. This story introduced the now bygone tradition of the Dr. Light episode. More specifically, the narrative structure this episode takes of following a certain character on the sidelines of Earth-based events throughout the show's run is actually a decent idea which a later episode by Davies would use to much greater effect. Elton's a compelling enough protagonist for one episode, and the detour where we further humanize Jackie is appreciated. There's value in the central metaphor of Linda as a group of fans who meet over Doctor Who and let genuine interpersonal connection and artistic passion and an emotional safe space bloom from their fandom, only to be invaded by the myopic and toxic Victor Kennedy who makes fandom into work. Unfortunately, it's the over-the-top tone the episode takes with the reveal of the Absorbloff that really kills it for me. Everything in the story's final third is just too silly to maintain my emotional investment. Fear Her was for a long time one of the most vocally hated episodes in the entire show, and wait, this is sounding familiar. Yeah, having this and Love and Monsters back to back dented the reputation of Series 2 quite a bit, I think. I'll give it this, it's one of those wackadoo ideas that you're only ever seeing from Doctor Who or an anthology show. This episode isn't really complete trash, so much as it is just sort of lame, and for me a lot of that is tone and pacing. Given the subject matter is child abduction, abusive parents, feelings of isolation and estrangement, all in a very domestic and relatable small town, I'd have shot for a much more grounded and serious tone for this episode. As it is, Chloe Webber and her mom's relationship is a compelling idea that the story doesn't really wring the juice out of. Word is, this episode was a last-minute addition to the series, and I think that tracks. For one, it feels pretty rushed, with the third act emotional beats not really landing, and for two, the 10th Doctor feels weirdly out of character. It just seems like Fear Her was written by somebody who only got the broadest possible description of what this Doctor is supposed to be like. Army of Ghosts and Doomsday are a sufficiently tragic goodbye to a dynamic and companion that I never really loved. Pete, Jackie, and Mickey are all great throughout, the Torchwood stuff is cool, and a satisfying payoff to that mystery. Yvonne Hartman is also an interesting character, with Tracy Ann Oberman finding the nuance in a cartoonishly jingoistic character. Anyone will tell you the biggest appeal of this story is seeing a massive Dalek Cybermen conflict, and you can feel Davies' enthusiasm for getting to do it through the whole thing. Many, myself included, have given Russell flack for how he handles story arcs in the past, but I think this two-parter does a great job at paying off ideas and plot points from all throughout the 2 seasons up to this point. It all feels properly grand, but by limiting the main action to a single office building, it avoids feeling too big for its britches. Overall, a pretty killer finale. Taken all together, Series 2 is best described as uneven. A funny following Series 1, which separates very evenly into great stories and mediocre ones, Series 2 is mostly good to great stories, held back by a couple unremarkable okay outings and a couple outright duds. Beyond episode quality, though, a recurring issue of Series 2 is being too cutesy for my tastes. The dynamic between the 10th Doctor and Rose is just so incredibly saccharine. No matter how much I come around on Rose as a character with years passing, to have her and the Doctor dating in all but name never comes off as natural or suited to the Doctor's character, and it's basically the default state of their relationship. It's weird, I don't like it, and it's a big deal here because it will be at least another 6 seasons before another Doctor-companion relationship dictates the emotional trajectory of the show as deeply and overtly as this one has. However, I do want to stress that as a run of TV episodes, this is still pretty solid, and it was a joy to revisit for the most part. Hey guys, I hope you're enjoying yourselves. Just wanted to say thanks a bunch, and subscribe if you like my work here. There's some older Doctor Who videos and upcoming stuff which you should absolutely check out. Anyway, back to the gig. I remember so much discussion in my early days of Doctor Who fandom about how Donna Noble left a bad first impression before she grew into a fan favorite, and every time I revisit The Runaway Bride, I disagree even as I totally get why that might be. She is definitely much more abrasive in the opening act of this story than she is anywhere else, but when the action finally slows down, Donna proves to be an incredibly empathetic character, and Catherine Tate and David Tennant have such immediate chemistry that it's crazy to think of her ever just being a one-episode appearance. Ironically, I'm most engaged with the story in its first half, when Donna is at her most off-putting and the adventure is all very zany, very terrestrial buddy adventure. There's just something about being stuck navigating the streets of London with a total stranger which suits the 10th Doctor, and I feel like this story is where 10 fully and finally solidifies as a character going into Series 3. Despite being a really cool villain design, the appearance of the Arachnos is when the story starts to lose me a bit. Smith & Jones is a really underappreciated series opener. Not only is it an effective jumping-on point for the show, with Martha Jones serving as an interesting surrogate through which new viewers can become enchanted with the Doctor and his adventures, it also, to my mind, feels like the story where modern Doctor Who really becomes itself, finally. Not to disparage Series 1 and 2, but in retrospect, parts of those seasons reek of growing pains. By this story, Tennant has settled into his take on the role, the visuals have gotten a bit cleaner, Murray Gold's musical voice for the show is solidified, the show feels freer and looser without one foot in the Powell estate at any given time. It just feels more like the Doctor Who that we'll be getting going forward than it did beforehand. Space cops pulling a building full of people away from the Earth to hunt down a prisoner in disguise is also such a fun concept. The Doctor and Martha evading both the Jadoon and their target with a ticking clock on the oxygen in the building makes for a fun, intense little cat and mouse. Prima Agyeman makes a wonderful first impression and a really solid little primer of a story. I mentioned in my Vincent and the Doctor review that I'd love it if episodes about artistic historical figures did more to implement the style of the artist in question into the story. And when I said that, I was primarily thinking of the Shakespeare Code. This episode is all about factoring the bard's nature as a wordsmith into the plot, and thematically is all about the power of language. But beyond having witches as the villains, it does precious little with Shakespearean narrative tropes or devices, which seems like a wasted opportunity. The Carrionites themselves are entirely shallow and archetypal villains, though the fact that they derive power and magic from words is such a great concept which the Big Finish audios would absolutely make much better use of with characters like Nobody No One. Dean Lennox Kelly is charming enough as Shakespeare, but charm ends up being all there really is to the guy beyond brief mentions of him having lost his son. There's no real arc to the character, even with the climax playing like there should be one. It ends up being one of those episodes where the Doctor and companion are the whole show, but Tennant and Agyeman don't have a ton of meat to chew on either. It's just kind of a passable nothing burger. Gridlock Grid rocks. Criminally underappreciated episode. I adore the stories that build out a whole culture from its sci-fi setting and premise, and the story of the Undercity of New Earth, complacent with spending years just driving in circles, is somehow soul-crushingly tragic, incredibly uplifting, and comedically absurd all at the same time. Few stories capture the sheer catharsis of feeling like the Doctor's truly saved or redeemed an entire planet with the emotional punch that this one does. And that's helped by great direction, but also some all-time great tracks from Murray Gold and a diverse, endearing sidecast. Gridlock is a pivotal juncture in the Doctor and Martha relationship, and some of my favorite acting from Tennant and Agyeman. Splitting the two of them up for the whole story was a great move that really forces both to assess where they stand, and sitting with the two of them as the Doctor finally opens up emotionally is up there for me as one of the great Doctor Who episode endings. I really wish this episode came up more often in discussions of this show, because to me it's an absolute classic and a highlight of the Tennant era. Daleks in Manhattan and Evolution of the Daleks have a lot going for it and a lot going against it. The accents are absolutely going to be a turnoff for people who can't appreciate the cheese like I do, though I could see how it might just clash with the mostly serious and dramatic tone of the script, combined with the infamously goofy Dalek-human hybrid makeup, and I think this is a case similar to the Torchwood episode Cyberwoman, where you've got a story that probably reads just fine on paper, but is hampered by everything in front of the camera. The Doctor willingly helping the Daleks with human experimentation also feels very iffy, borderline out of character, but you can spin it, kinda. I'll tell you what though, for as unbelievably hokey as the accents are, the performances and characterizations are otherwise pretty endearing. I like Tallulah. I think Solomon and Diagoras are interesting human proxies for the Doctor and Daleks, and if absolutely nothing else, the story is carried by the way that Tennant plays the Doctor's utter hatred for the Daleks. Not gonna die on a hill defending this one, but it's far from the worst. The Lazarus Experiment is an interesting premise that I think gets a little squandered by pivoting way too quickly into monster movie schlock. There's a lot of Cronenberg's The Fly in this story, and I'd love a somewhat more meditative and dialogue-driven episode where the Doctor confronts the first semi-successful human attempt at achieving immortality, only for the process to go wrong in a way more gradual and subtle. You can still get to a big monstrous threat by the end, but it just feels rushed here. The pseudoscience behind it ringing too far-fetched even for this show doesn't help matters, even if part of me does love how truly grotesque and singular the monster design is. For all that though, the episode is still mostly strong, particularly in its second half, where we get a great scene between the Doctor and Lazarus where Mark Gatiss and David Tennant just get to act off one another, and Martha asserting herself and gaining full-time companion status at the end is super cathartic. Overall, I'd say this one's alright with flashes of greatness. Believe it or not, I've actually reviewed 42 twice over this channel's lifetime. I'm going to use Chris Chibnall as a negative point of comparison just a few episodes from now, so it's ironic that I think his first entry on the show is really quite strong. The key word for this story is tension. 42 minutes on the clock means the cast can't afford to waste a breath. No rising action, no downtime as we wait for the threat to arrive, just toss the characters into the fire and turn the heat up and up and up and up and up as things get worse with every passing scene. Something as simple as having characters visibly sweating and haggard from the heat really adds to the sense of running a gauntlet. I also think it manages to be compelling thematically, a story about cynicism and despair versus hope and determination that pushes the Doctor and Martha in fun ways. It's funny watching the story post Chibnall's own era as showrunner because I can see a lot of Jodie Whittaker and how the Doctor is written here. Not so much that Ten doesn't feel like himself, but enough that it's interesting. You can also see some of Chibnall's go-to narrative tropes, like not having the Doctor be the one who solves the conflict in the end. 42 is not exactly top tier, but it's one that I'm always happy to revisit. Human Nature and the Family of Blood is a real masterpiece. A premise that very easily could have been a single episode here really benefits from the breathing room allowed by a whole hour and 30 minutes. We get to really live with the life of John Smith and humanize characters like Joan and Tim, with Jessica Hines doing some particularly powerful acting in her final on-screen moments. Tennant's performance as John Smith is so very clearly its own character while still having shades of the Doctor in him, to the point where we feel like our hero's really gone and share in Martha's frustration. Speaking of Martha, man, what a gauntlet for her. She's the real hero for most of this one, and Freema Agyeman goes so hard that I tend to think of this as Martha's definitive story. Also impressive are the villains here, especially Harry Lloyd and Rebecca Staton, who are hamming it up big time. Truly some top-tier one-off villains. The story also comes with some effective anti-war commentary. There's a grit to it that the show doesn't have that often. Leave your own thoughts on this episode in the comments, and subscribe for more reviews like this one. Blink is iconic. For a long time, it was one of the show's defining episodes within the nascent internet fandom sphere, and for reasons I won't get into, the single Doctor Who story that I've seen far and away the most times. Personally, I've never quite loved it as much as I have appreciated it. It's Moffat, so the word of the day is clever, and it's a very clever game of cat and mouse, with very memorable and unique monsters and a clever, scary use of time travel. The story exists to explore the concept of the Weeping Angels, and it performs that job near perfectly. What makes it just a great episode rather than an all-time great one is that while the emotional beats around Sally Sparrow all land, Sally herself isn't a super well-defined character. She's compelling and multifaceted enough, and Carey Mulligan has more than enough talent to convey all she needs to, so I like Sally. But despite having watched this episode so often, I still struggle to define Sally Sparrow the person, or give an impression of any life she has beyond this episode. Leave your own thoughts on this episode in the comments, and subscribe for more reviews like this one. I was torn on how to approach Utopia, since it is very much part of a single 3-part narrative, but trying to sum up my feelings toward all 3 parts in 1 minute was never gonna work. Of the 3 episodes, Utopia is easily the best, and if it were somehow more self-contained, I think it would go down as an all-time classic. The Yana persona is incredibly charming, and Derek Jacobi does a brilliant job playing not just him, but also his tragic, mad, violent master reasserting itself. The guy gets to play the Master for about 5 minutes and might have the single best performance of the character in that time. Taken as a piece, Utopia is an incredibly tragic story. It starts so hopeful with the return of a fan-favorite character in Jack Harkness and the Doctor finding such kinship in Yana and admiration in his plight and his genius, only for his own mere presence to indirectly destroy that good, kind man as the very, very last remnants of the human species are tricked into an early grave. It's all pretty metal. The Sound of Drums is the Doctor Who equivalent to a great big over-the-top conspiracy thriller, with The Last of the Timelords as its more grandiose payoff. It's much easier for me to talk about these two as a pair than it is to talk about them with Utopia as a trilogy, united by the Earthbound setting and John Sims' Master, who I think makes a mixed first impression here. Honestly, I found these episodes weirdly hard to get through on this viewing. Aside from the final shark-jumping 15 minutes, I don't think they really do anything terrible, but so much of my time spent with these, I was wishing that I was watching another episode, which feels mean, but it's just all I could think about for most of it. It's a satisfying enough stopping place for Martha as a companion, I'll give it that, and an Earthbound manhunt for the Doctor isn't a concept we typically see, but I don't know, never been a fan of these, and that hasn't exactly changed. Don't ask me why, but starting with this episode there's a shift in my brain, where I consider the yearly Christmas special part of the immediately preceding series rather than the following. Which makes Series 3 the only one whose wrap-up video will take into account 2 Christmas specials. Voyage of the Damned could be a Chris Chibnall story, and I don't mean that in a good way. This one is actually something that I talk about in a bit more detail in my last yearly channel Christmas video, so go check that one out if you want a bit more of the works. As the one-episode guest companion, Kylie Minogue can be a bit too over the top in the performance. She and Russel T are both really hammy for much of their screen time, and it's not to the story's benefit. It's really down to Tennant to carry this one, and he does an admirable job to the point where I'd recommend it on his performance alone, but for no other reason. The fact that I don't care much for Voyage of the Damned or the climax of Last of the Timelords means I often leave Series 3 on a bit of a down note, which is a shame because it spoils the fact that as a comprehensive run of episodes, Series 3 is really strong. You've got Voyage and Shakespeare Code, which are duds, then you've got The Last of the Timelords, which I think is alright, and then you've got a whole 10 episodes out of 14 left, which are an absolute ball at their lowest and still some of the best stories the show's ever done at their highest. I've alluded to it before, but Series 3 is, for me, where Doctor Who really becomes itself. Matures fully into the show that it will be for the rest of its lifetime, and it begins what I consider the longest run of quality episodes on average. Martha is quietly a peak companion, and Tennant solidifies his take on the character here as one of the most iconic helmings of the role. Partners in Crime lives in my head as the least memorable series premiere the modern show has ever had, barring maybe New Earth, and that speaks less to its quality than to it just not having a notable selling point beyond the return of Donna. It's not a new companion or a new Doctor, it's not the return of any big enemies or plot threads, there's absolutely nothing to make this one an event, just a solid Earthbound mystery that's heavy on the comedy and reasserting the Doctor and Donna's best friend character chemistry. The gag of them both just missing each other all throughout the first half of the story is utter nonsense, and I love it. Series 4's plot arc of the missing planets is one of my favorite in the show, and Partners in Crime sets a nice precedent by making it pivotal but unobtrusive background for the plot of the episode. Matron Ophelia is a fun enough villain, and if nothing else, the adipose are memorably adorable. The Fires of Pompeii is another one of those most rewatched episodes in the series for me. It's one of those that balances being a fun, fantastical adventure with an emotionally sober take on a historical tragedy. With just 2 adventures under their belt before now, the Doctor and Donna are already a pretty lovable duo, but it's this story that gives us our first glimpse into the dramatic potential of Donna's character and Catherine Tate's performance, and fully solidifies the pair as an all-time great TARDIS team. It's the dynamic and tension between the two of them that elevates this one for me. It would have already been more than solid, the supporting cast, the Pyroviles, Lucius Dextrous, they're all interesting enough, but imagining this one with Rose or Martha, I don't think it would be one I rate so highly. Planet of the Ood, aka the Doctor and Donna incite an actual for real slave revolt. I think this episode was made in part to address how out of character the Doctor and the show itself were in their handling of the Ood back in the Satan episodes. And boy, does it really go whole hog on the compensation. Commodified slaves, complete with a literal slave trade, heck, gas chambers, it's a really heavy topic for an episode. Yeah, it's all done with aliens, so there's a level of separation from reality, but the story is really unflinching with how gross and perverse such a practice is. It's not one of my favorite episodes, which is maybe evidenced by how even shorter than usual this video is, but if someone told me it was one of theirs, I'd totally get it. You know, I've always liked the Sontarans a lot. Their great iconic designs and their single-minded warmongering makes them extremely compelling foils to the Doctor, same as the Daleks. Even beyond all that, I think the Sontaran Strategem and the Poisoned Sky is a really fun two-parter. It's well directed, the comedy and the emotional beats hit, especially with Donna and Wilf. I like Ross, I think Ratigan is a good mix of slimy, obnoxious, and sympathetic, and I like how much of a high-stakes action blowout it is. Thematically, I think it's a stroke of genius to have the Sontarans be the villains of a unit story, and one about how the Doctor's way of life might accidentally militarize his own companions. Conversely, the Doctor's distaste for military and guns and stuff is super overplayed in this one, and I'd like it if the story made a point that maybe he was compensating for something. Beyond that, his characterization is on point, and Tennant is great as always. For all that we do not speak of Gareth Roberts, the Unicorn and the Wasp is one I've always looked on fondly. I always like when Doctor Who does a whole genre pastiche like this, and it's a really fun, silly romp with jokes that really work for me. The Doctor having been poisoned and playing the world's highest stakes game of charades is a downright iconic bit, especially. What really anchors the story though is Fenella Woolgar as Agatha Christie. You can just feel how torn she is, with a mind that's sharp and gung-ho about solving this mystery, but also this cynical self-derision that crops up and tells her to stop having fun or not get too confident. It grounds an otherwise very farcical episode in a story about a woman's expanding view of the world, herself, and her art, and I think it all clicks. The Doctor and Donna are on their A-game here. You can tell this is one of those adventures where they're both just having a great time. Ironically, the things that most hold the episode back are both parts of its title. The culprit being a big alien wasp feels kinda arbitrary, and I don't think the inclusion of the unicorn jewel thief is given enough space to add anything to the episode besides a red herring. Silence in the Library and Forest of the Dead are a masterpiece, period, end of. Most standout to me on this viewing was the visual direction, really immersing you in the sets and providing a haunting, creepy atmosphere, even in the idyllic domestic cow world scenes. Being a two-parter, Stephen Moffat is able to do service to a lot of great sci-fi ideas. The Vashta Nerada, the data ghosts, the inner workings of the library, the very idea of River's Song, it's all just absolutely brilliant. On top of that, this story contains absolutely spectacular performances, not just from Tennant Tate and Alex Kingston, but also from everyone only appearing in this pair of episodes, as well as some all-time best work from Murray Gold. 15 years later, I think there's a strong argument that this pair of episodes remain Stephen Moffat's magnum opus. Midnight is an all-timer for a nearly endless number of reasons, but chief among them is its study of human nature, specifically relative to the way Doctor Who typically works. In a show where we tend to make one-off human characters endearing or sympathetic or heroic after a fashion, Midnight shows us what occurs when a Doctor Who story happens to the wrong type of person. To say that this episode showcases the worst or most cynical of humanity feels like oversimplifying, because it really creates an entire cast of mundane, totally average people whose vanity, cowardice, insecurity, paranoia, and self-importance arise in a very believable way from these very horrifying circumstances. As a companion light story, this one really showcases the Doctor's flaws as well, and how an ego like the 10th Doctor's can especially be a serious hindrance with no human partner to ground him and compensate for his eccentricities. Something I don't think that this episode gets enough credit for is Leslie Sharp, who in the third act manages to channel the voice of David Tennant, even as she's doing this slow, creepy variant of it. The Midnight entity is chilling in concept, but in execution it's Sharp opposite Tennant that really makes the episode. Turn Left is the prime showcase of Catherine Tate, and maybe the most emotionally intense episode of the entire show, to the point that I find it the hardest to re-watch. Over 45 minutes, Tate gets to run the gamut of everything that makes Donna Noble an all-time great character. Not only does she single-handedly balance the story's almost absurd level of heartrending tragedy and dread with a performance that sells all that and some killer comedic deliveries, but she also expertly communicates this Donna who turned right as a separate figure from Donna Prime. Having never met the Doctor, she's more vapid and self-interested, her lack of self-esteem running even deeper, yet her heart and conviction is all still there. On top of that, Bernard Cribbins and Jacqueline King do their share of heavy lifting as well, as does Graham Harper's direction. The world building of this what-if scenario where the Doctor dies back in Runaway Bride is majorly effective, even if it feels like the story sometimes cheats to make those scenarios work. The Stolen Earth and Journey's End is the Avengers Endgame of this entire era of Doctor Who. It's a big blockbuster crossover where we bring everybody back for an equal parts emotional and bombastic romp against the Daleks. I think this one manages to play even if you haven't kept up with Torchwood or the Sarah Jane adventures, and it nicely ties up the underlying themes of Series 4. The Daleks doing a full-scale invasion of Earth is something that the show's teased throughout its run, but finally seeing it happen here feels like a real event. Julian Bleach is the best Davros, bringing a real thespian pathos to a slimy sadist of a villain. I will say, now that we have the 2023 14th Doctor specials, I gotta admit that I like them as a concluding chapter for Donna more than I like where we leave her here. To this day, I don't care for how contrived the meta-crisis is, all in service of giving Rose a happily ever after that just feels kinda cheap. It's a really strong pair of episodes that has just enough holding it back to be noticeable, I think. Series 4 feels like a refined version of Series 3, the same way Series 3 feels like a refined version of Series 2. There's an overwhelming sense of confidence here, like now is when the show well and truly knows its hot stuff and can tell some riskier, heavier stories like it's no big deal. It goes without saying at this point, but a big thing that really elevates this run is David Tennant and Catherine Tate. It's the modern show's first all-time great Doctor-companion dynamic, and it makes even the weakest stories of the season incredibly watchable. You could give me 7 seasons of just these two in the TARDIS and I don't think think I'd ever get bored. It's not flawless, nothing is. A couple of the stories here are disposable or messy, but I don't think that there's any complete duds in the whole pack. It's all within the range of spotty but fun enough TV to some of the best things I've ever seen. The Next Doctor is a great big tease of a premise. Granted, in some ways the idea of a normal human man having the Doctor's identity grafted onto him is in many ways as interesting as meeting an incarnation of himself unknown to the audience. David Morrissey's performance when he's in Doctor mode has something of a Colin Baker quality to it, which makes me wish I could see him in the role for real. When he's not in Doctor mode, Jackson Lake is sympathetic but also lays it on a bit thick acting-wise. Mercy Hartigan is a sorta lame villain, and the Cybermen don't make a great showcase here either. It's honestly weird to remember that this is the first proper Cybermen story since Series 2, but this is the start of a trend where the Cybermen as antagonists begin to feel underserved. Certainly not helped by this being a story that's heavy on delete and light on conversion. The Cyber King is also really stupid. It's a shame, cause in theory, a Cybermen story about the way human minds like Lake and Hartigan run away from emotional trauma is genius, but in execution, this is one of those more disposable ones. It's the Daniel Kaluuya episode! And the Mouse Hunt guy's here too! Planet of the Dead is an episode I've always dismissed, but on this watch I've actually enjoyed it a lot. It's most interesting when considered as the anti-Midnight, in the sense that the Doctor is once again stuck with a bus full of humans, only now it's all the right humans for a funny, sweet, and uplifting adventure instead of a dark, stressful mood piece. Lady Christina is more fun as a one-off companion than I tend to remember. I could genuinely watch her and Tennant together for a whole series, which I suppose is the point by the end. I also find Malcolm incredibly endearing. All of the plot stuff and alien shenanigans is a little thin, but honestly, sometimes this show benefits from a kind of shallow plot that makes room for more character moments. This is maybe the hardest I've ever turned around on an episode for this project. I used to really dislike it, but this viewing was just delightful. The Waters of Mars is like top 3 for me as far as Tennant stories go. The Doctor and this crew of colonists evading the distinctly horrifying flood monsters would make for a memorably tense and spooky episode all by itself, like a water park variant of the Satan episodes, but add in the Doctor's internal conflict over not interfering with this fixed point in time, and it soars into what's effectively a climax for his character so far. Coming off the warm and fuzzy ending of The Next Doctor and the generally lighthearted, triumphant vibe of Planet of the Dead, this story is like a bucket of cold water to the face as we watch these good and innocent people picked off one by one until the Doctor just breaks and becomes the worst of himself. What a sequence once he does, though. Some of the best direction, editing, and scoring in the whole show. Between this and the next one, a large part of me thinks that this is a better capper for Tennant's time on the show, and regardless, it's a classic for the ages. It's time for the end and the end of time, and I'm sorry, I really want to like this one, but from the opening minutes onward, I just find this story so full of stupid plot nonsense and off-putting melodrama, and I just can't get into it. It's another big blockbuster, but it's just chock full of so many dumb, time-consuming little things that don't contribute much to my enjoyment, and even the stuff that is worth spending time on just feels overwrought. I dislike the portentous, morose approach the story takes to the Doctor's impending regeneration. It creates a really sour mood under the whole thing. Revisiting it makes me happy that RTD decided to come back to the series, because as an endpoint, this one makes me feel more bitter than anything else. It plods along full of sound and fury when frankly it could have been a single episode. The best thing I can say about it is how hard Murray Gold goes. I also always forget that President Obama is just hanging around on the sidelines of this story too. That's really weird. Overall, it's been really rewarding going back through the original RTD era of Doctor Who. From Series 1 up through Series 4, you can feel as the show becomes a bigger, sharper, more confident and singular version of itself with each passing year. Almost every episode has been better than I tend to remember it in years past. I can count the stories that I call less than passable throughout the entire era on one hand. This is them, by the way. There's a real sense of completeness going from Rose up to the end of time, which has less to do with plot or characters than it does a sense that Davies said all he had to say with the show at the time over the course of these 5 years. I appreciate this era so much more as a comprehensive run of stories than I did when starting this retrospective, which is really the best outcome for it. So far, this experiment has been a reminder of why this is my all-time favorite show. I'm hoping you've enjoyed listening to my thoughts so far and will continue with me into the Moffat era. For the record, the way that I approach producing these shorts is to watch an episode of the show and, as I'm going through it, take some notes that I'll then whittle down into the short itself. Basically, capturing highlights of my viewing as I'm watching the episode. This means that every review you're seeing in a video like this is incredibly immediate. And while that immediacy is a big part in pretty much any media review, by anyone, let alone myself, I think there's value in stepping back and seeing how episodes of a thing hold up, given even just a little bit of time and distance. Hence why several weeks out from having recorded my video about the end of time, and my short appraising the entirety of the RTD era, I'm here recording this largely unscripted coda as a way to just sort of loosely talk about where I stand on this era right now, without the constraints of the 1-minute time limit. I'm gonna be completely honest, it's also an easy excuse to pad out the runtime of this video to over an hour because I know how much YouTube loves the longer running times. That said, I am going to generally take a kind of structured, chronological approach to talking about this still, just because I think that'll be easier to do ultimately. Still, being very, very broad about it, throughout this project I've come to appreciate how it's really concretely two different ways in which I think about any given series or era in Doctor Who. But to make it explicit, I just think that there's the one viewing of a given series or era where it's sort of this miasma, this whole object that exists largely in kind of half-formed memories, if you're me, and the other sort of viewing which is cleanly separating it out into a run of episodes and averaging the quality of that run, or comparing highlights of one run versus highlights of another, or the low points of one series versus the low points of another series. And I think generally, in both metrics, the RTD era has improved quite a bit from my memory. Because I'm going to be honest, the conclusion that I come to by the end of my Series 4 shorts, which is that Series 3 and Series 4 are in large part the height of the Russell era, in large part a height of the show as a whole, like running up to now. I've always maintained that. I've always maintained the idea that Series 3, 4, and 5 are collectively the peak of this show. And I guess you'll just have to wait a little bit until after I'm done with a short break and begin posting the Matt Smith era reviews to see how well my memory of Series 5 holds up. But for a long time, I've always broadly sort of said to myself that 3, 4, and 5 are where I enjoy the show the most. And so it's not really a surprise that watching through the RTD era again for this project, that largely ended up being true once again. 3 and 4 were far and away preferable to me compared to 1 and 2. But what was a little bit of a surprise was revisiting specific episodes that I'd always been kind of dismissive of or had less than great viewings the last time I saw them, and realizing that, oh, like these are specifically contributors to why I love these runs of episodes so much. So in the case of Series 3, that was Gridlock and, to a lesser extent, stuff like the Dalek two-parter and the Lazarus Experiment, where I'll just say that, like, going into this project, before I'd done shorts on them, I'd always considered Smith & Jones an incredibly strong series opener, and one that I would recommend that people get into the show with if, for whatever reason, they weren't going to watch something like The 11th Hour or The Pilot, which I think are the show's strongest entry points. So I've always held Smith & Jones in high esteem. I've always enjoyed 42 a lot, especially with Chibnall being the showrunner for so long and having to sort of contend with the rest of the fandom with the idea that once upon a time, Chibnall as showrunner for Doctor Who was a very exciting prospect for me. I would often find myself praising 42, and stuff like Human Nature, Family of Blood, Blink, and Utopia are all so universally beloved that they kind of just sit in my memory as those, not like perfect in Blink's case, because I've never been the biggest fan of Blink compared to everyone else, but those all sit in my memory as like the things that made Series 3 most worth it. But revisiting Gridlock especially, I was so in love with Gridlock on my last couple of viewings, but especially this most recent one. And it's one of those episodes that I think is just a perfect diluted sort of piece of what makes this show brilliant, and all of the, like, the best things about Tennant's performance, the writing of this era, the general tone and vibe of Russell Era 1 is captured in Gridlock, I think. And the Lazarus Experiment isn't that good, but it hits enough high points to where I'm like, yeah, this episode exists as a point in favor for Series 3. And the Dalek two-parter, again, I mentioned this in the short, but it's often dismissed just for how silly it is on its face. Mainly just how silly the trappings of it are, like the pig men, the American accents from all these British actors. But if you're able to ignore that and sort of just absorb it as just this quaint little part of the production, then if you can do that, I think there is a still flawed but emotionally engaging, interesting, unique story to be had with those two episodes. It's still in the lower end of stuff in Series 3, but it's better than I think it's given credit for, and I would call it a good pair of episodes. And even the stuff that I don't love as much, like I don't love the sound of drums in The Last of the Timelords. I really don't love Shakespeare Code and Voyage of the Damned, but if someone told me they did, if someone told me that they really got a kick out of both those episodes, I would totally get it. Like, there's no awful episodes in Series 3. And I realize how that sounds, because to me that sounds like, well, ideally if a season is going to be one of your favorite seasons of one of your favorite shows of all time, then it shouldn't have any awful episodes. Like, TV shows manage to go whole seasons without having any awful episodes all the time. But with a show like this, with the way that certain episodes exist by reputation, and especially with me not revisiting so many of them for years and years, it's always pleasant to come to an episode where you're expecting, like, man, this one's going to be a slog, and I'm just going to have to get through it to get to the really high points that make this show my favorite. And you sit down with it, and it's like, oh no, that's, like, not great, but it's a romp with enough great things in it, or enough things that I could see appealing to someone in it, where even something like that still exists as a reflection of why I love this show. And it's really funny the way that Series 4 ends up being that, but even more. Where there's episodes of Series 4 that I won't say the fandom at large, but I know specific people do not care for. But going through it, there was The Doctor's Daughter, which I thought was very, very flawed, but had its strengths, and ultimately was compelling to watch and engaging enough that I wasn't complaining about having to sit through it. And there's The Stolen Earth and Journey's End, which are not what I go to this show for. Like the big blowout, full-scale Earth invasion where we bring back all the characters and it's a whole climax to the last several years. That kind of story's not what I come to Doctor Who for. And I think as we go through the rest of this show and the rest of these shorts, a pattern's going to emerge where my favorite series finales tend to be the more low-key ones, with a smaller cast of characters and a smaller scale. But given that caveat, given that its issue, quote-unquote, is really just that it's not my preference of Doctor Who's setup, Journey's End and Stolen Earth are still really, really compelling episodes of TV. And so given that the two-part finale and The Doctor's Daughter are the weak spots, Series 4 is almost kind of miraculous, because everything else is just so much fun, if it's not some of the best television that I've ever watched. And that, for me, should be the balance for Doctor Who. No wonder that I praise Series 4 so much, because to me, it, and to a lesser extent Series 3, and we'll see about Series 5, are my platonic ideal for a Doctor Who series, where it is a even mix of stories that I think are solid, but not for me, stories that are just really, really solid, fun romps like fun bits of 45-minute television to sit with the family and just hang out and have a good time. And then there's the masterpieces. Like, any great series of Doctor Who should be a mix of those three things, I think. Because if everything was a Silence in the Library, or Forest of the Dead, or a Midnight, or a Turn Left, that would get way too intense. It would get intense to the point of, like, being uncomfortable almost to watch. I almost got uncomfortable watching Turn Left on this viewing, and I think a large part of that is Turn Left coming off Midnight, coming off of the library episodes, where it is an incredibly powerful run of 3 back-to-back-to-back great stories, but also it gets a little bit too emotionally heavy, and you've got to break those up with your Unicorns and the Wasps, or your Sontaran two-parters, or your Partners in Crime, where the episodes can just be kind of goofy and still have a clear heart and a pathos to them, but are much more about having fun and less about narrative tightness or having the deepest thematic structure. And it's funny to say that because the show has always had that balance. Like, we open this show with Series 1 having that clear tonal intent. It's the mix of the moody masterpieces, the heavier stuff, the goofy romp episodes, or at least the comparatively low stakes ones, and the ones that are aiming for, let's just say, an audience who isn't me. But 3 and 4 really capture that vibe to the greatest extent, and the specials end up being something that was easier for me to appreciate on this viewing with that approach in my head. Because I used to say that out of the 4 specials, The Waters of Mars was the only good one. And it was like the quality average was bolstered to an even keel just by the strength of that story being surrounded by these 3 other duds. And while The End of Time still did nothing for me, I was able to more easily appreciate The Next Doctor and Planet of the Dead for being the sillier stories, for being the more lighthearted ones, for being the ones where stuff like the Cybermen not being utilized great, or having weird kind of dumb alien designs in Planet of the Dead, and kind of a plot that didn't really have a lot to it. I was much more comfortable letting those things coast on vibes this go around. But speaking of Series 1, I'd say that Series 1 was the only one of the runs of episodes, in counting the specials as their own run of episodes, that's 5. So of the 5 episode runs, I think Series 1 is the only one in this project that suffered and went down in my estimation from where I used to have it. Because I remember thinking of Series 1 as a pretty solid start to this show. And in a purely utilitarian way, I think it still sort of is, where again, you get the variety of tones and intents and the different things that this show can and will be given to you over the course of Series 1 if you're watching it for the first time. But taking it as a bunch of episodes where you assess the quality of each one and average it out, it was really kind of surprising looking back on Series 1 and realizing how much of it just did nothing for me. Where, I look at Rose, and I look at The End of the World, and I appreciate those 2 episodes and what they're trying to do, but they really don't do much for me personally, and I don't look at them as episodes that I'm eager to go back to. There's a reason that I often recommend people start this show with the pilot, or start it with the 11th Hour, or start it with Smith and Jones. Rose is at the bottom of my list of recommending where people start this show with, and it's just because I don't think it's a very good episode. And on one of the polls that I did, I had someone who was surprised about that, and that makes sense. That's kind of a surprising thing to say. I won't start someone off with this show on the first episode just because the way that Doctor Who is structured, I think it's such a rare opportunity to have so many potential starting points that are really, really good episodes of television on top of decent introductions to the premise that you can then work backward from. And Rose is just one of those where, especially if you know the kind of show that this can turn into, it's not really the most narratively tight, thematically interesting. Pacing-wise, it's kind of sluggish. And that ends up describing a lot of Series 1, where I think that's the end of the world, I think that's the Unquiet Dead, that's the Slitheen episodes, and that's the long game. Like, once we hit Dalek, then it's pretty much in stride, where the long game is the only weak one left in the latter half of the show. But that opening run of stories, like excluding Dalek and going from Rose to the long game, is like, it was rough to get through. And I could see someone watching this show for the first time, and it only being at Dalek, where they're like, oh, okay, maybe this show has something to it. Maybe this show has the juice. Because until then, it's a lot of individual scenes in those episodes that I think are great, and you, like, maybe give it the leeway of, it was 2005, it was nearly 20 years ago, it was a different era of TV. But I don't know, that all feels like excuse-making to me, and yeah, it's just a really interesting thing about this experiment, being that Series 1 is the one that came out the other side looking a bit meeker and thinner and not as appealing as it once did. Series 2 actually used to be the one that trailed behind the pack for me for the longest time. And I think that was just, again, for a long time, that series being the one with Love and Monsters and Fear Her back to back, which were two, like, reviled episodes, I think, until later eras of the show came along and kind of drowned out the reputation that those stories had. And that compared with Rose for a long time being a character that I actively disliked, her and Tennant being a dynamic that I never cared for. All of that came together to give Series 2 this really downer rep in my brain, but looking at it, it's really not a noticeably weaker run of stories. I think saying that it starts with Christmas Invasion, which I don't care too much for, it's Christmas Invasion, Tooth and Claw, Love and Monsters, and Fear Her, which are the four, and The Idiot's Lantern, because of that ending. So 5 of them. So 5 out of these 13 stories where I'm just like, this isn't for me, I don't love it. But between everything else, it's got a quaintness that does not feel like it holds back Series 3 and 4. It feels like Series 3 and 4 refine this show in a way where Series 2 is still kind of shaggy and a little cheaper and a little bit more feeling itself out. And I don't know, if I have to sum this up with anything to, like, end this ramble, because I think I've gone on long enough, it's just to say that I'm glad I did this, because it really gave me an interesting sort of bigger picture perspective on this show, and this era specifically. It's given me a sort of new appreciation and new perspective of Russel T Davies' approach to the show, and how it improved with time, that I'm looking to see, I'm looking forward to seeing that reflected in Ncudi's era, when we properly get into that. So, I don't know. Again, this whole, like, last 30 or so minutes is mainly just here to pad out the runtime. I will not be disappointed or shocked if anyone has long turned the video off by this stage. If you're still here, thank you. I hope that you've subscribed. I hope you enjoyed this. Let me know what you think about any of this stuff in the comments. And I'll see you much later, if you're not watching the shorts, when we do this again for the Moffat era.